Well, hello, David. It's great to see you again. My members are still buzzing about the 3 hours you spent with them talking about culture as a strategic competitive advantage. I know we only have about 20 minutes right now, but I'm excited for our guests to hear from you on this topic.
Be my pleasure.
So, what I'd love to do is I'd love just to kick off and it seems like all CEOs and leaders know that culture is important, but it's
Yes.
really somewhat of an elusive topic. I mean, we
Yeah.
talk about things, but it's like how do you make it actionable? So I'd love to start with even how do you define culture?
Yeah. So to me, Margaret, culture is really the set of behaviors that govern how a group operates. And so forget all the fluff. At the end of the day, in any group of people, whether it's a company or it's a sports team or it's a family or it's a classroom, in any group of people, there are certain ways that people behave in how they relate to each other. And to me, that's really what the culture is. And the reason that that's important to see it through that lens is, as we talk more about the way that I teach people, at the end of the day, if we understand that culture is largely about behavior, then if we want to do something about culture, we have to do something about behavior, as obvious as that sounds. And so seeing it through a behavior lens is what enables us to take action about it. And you're right, for so many, it tends to be very elusive. It's this squishy, soft kind of thing. There's something I used to do. I didn't do this with your members when I was there, but something that I used to do with many CEOs is I'll go around the room and I'll ask CEOs, so on a 1 to 5 scale, how important is culture in terms of the bottom line? Like, let's cut through the fluff. Let's talk about making money. With 1 being it's not that big a deal, 5 being it's an enormous impact on the bottom line. And I'll ask people, and I'll go around the room, and most CEOs will give it a 4 or a 5. Most will actually give it a 5. And I inevitably, if I have 15 people in the room, at least one person gives it like a 7 on a 1 to 5 scale. So they all know that this is really important to their bottom line. And then I do this thing where I ask them, all right, so how many people in the room, and your listeners could even do this in their own head right now, but I'll ask people in the room, I'll say, all right, so how many of you have some written, documented strategic plan for your goals, your initiatives, your priorities? What do you need to accomplish this year as a company? And most of them will raise their hand. They have that. And I'll ask them, so how many of you have a sales plan that documents, your targets, your quotas? How are you going to hit your sales number? Most of them have that. And I say, so I'm sure you all have a financial plan. You're not running your company without some kind of a financial plan, a budget, a forecast, and obviously they all have that. And then I'll ask them, so how many of you have some kind of a written, documented culture plan for how you're driving the culture of your company? And almost nobody does. And I'll say to them, so let me just see if I understand this. You just told me that this was a 5 in terms of its impact on your bottom line, and you're just winging it, hoping it works out on its own. That would be like, saying, we don't need that financial plan, a budget. That's overrated. Who needs that stuff? And if we didn't have a financial plan, it doesn't mean, by the way, that we wouldn't still be trying to generate as much revenue as we could or manage our expenses intelligently. We'd still be doing that, but our chances of hitting our numbers would be a heck of a lot less if we had no plan for it. And the same is true of culture, that if we understand that it's as important to our bottom line as most CEOs will acknowledge, then my point of view is, well, then we ought to be as systematic about our culture, as planned about our culture, as we are about our finances, our operations, our sales, or other important parts of the company. And to your point earlier, most aren't. It just feels too squishy and too elusive to them. And so what I try to do is help make it concrete for them.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I never thought about having a culture plan, but after spending time with you last week, it touches everything about the business. So it is really
Absolutely.
a no-brainer. I mean, how do you not
Yeah.
have that? So that's really a, a, a great important nugget. And I would say that if after this conversation or after someone hires you or spends time with you, they'll realize that in terms of the bottom line, it should be more like 9 or 10.
Yes, it should be.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and to your point about affecting everything, I sometimes say it this way, like if you think about all the different things as a CEO that I could work on in my company, there probably is no higher leverage item to work on than your culture because of what you
Yeah.
just said, because it affects everything else. That get the culture right, it affects your ability to hire and retain the people you want. Everybody's struggling with the labor shortage. So how do you get the pick of the best people that are out there? It's hard enough to find people. I at least want to have the best shot at getting the best people. How do I make sure I'm holding on to my people? It affects how well your people do service to whoever it is that they serve. It affects how innovative they are. It affects how well they collaborate with each other. It affects the pride they take in the quality of the work they're doing. I mean, it affects just about
Yeah,
everything.
it
And so,
touches everything.
yeah. And so what
That's why
higher
it really
leverage?
should be that 9 or
Yeah,
10. That's right. I
this
agree.
should be the number one thing.
Okay, so people need a plan.
Yes.
What are, easier said than done
Sure.
without
Of
talking to you
course.
first. So, if there are one or two things that a CEO should do that could have a huge impact on culture, you talked a little bit before about behaviors, you talked about this plan. What would this look like?
Yeah, good question. So let me try to make it really simple for your listeners. So I organize the steps that it takes to be really systematic around a framework that I call the 8-step framework. 8 things. When leaders and companies do these 8 things, this is how you have a plan for this. But let's just get it really simple. And at the end of the day, if you just cut to the chase, there's 2 of the 8 steps that have even more impact than anything else. And those 2 things are, number one, how do we define exactly what we want the culture to be? Because if we don't define that clearly enough, we're not going to be able to create any kind of a specific culture. And when we talk about how to do that, so I'm going to give you these 2 steps. The first is defining it. When we talk about how to do that, you asked earlier about, what culture is, and I said that it's about behaviors. I make a really big deal about the difference between what I call values and what I call behaviors. So values are abstract ideas: quality, integrity, loyalty, passion, commitment, etc. Behaviors are actions, things that we can see people doing. So some of the behaviors that I teach in my company are things like practice blameless problem solving, honor commitments, be a fanatic about response time, get clear on expectations. These are actions that people do. So a values abstract the behaviors in action. The reason that this is an important concept for your listeners is that the problem with most organizations' traditional looking set of core values is that they tend to be so abstract that they mean too many different things to different people, and they therefore become hard to operationalize. Behaviors, because their actions, are much easier to teach and coach and guide and give people feedback about. So step number one in this process is defining the culture that you want to have in terms of a set of specific behaviors that you can say as a leader, if I could get my people doing these things consistently, that's what's going to make us really successful. And I give those behaviors a name. It's just my nomenclature for it. I call them fundamentals because they're fundamental to success. So the first thing we have to do is define the terms of a set of fundamental behaviors that when we do these things, that's what we want our culture to be. Now, the second step in this overall framework, which is really the game changer, is something that I call creating rituals. So a ritual is a routine, a habit, something that we do over and over and over again until it becomes second nature. It's just part of our routine. You get up in the morning, you brush your teeth. When I was a kid in school, we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. You go to a ball game, we do the national anthem. They're just routines. And the reason that rituals or routines are so important is that most people are not very good, and most organizations aren't very good at sticking with things. We come up with wonderful ideas and they all sound great. And then we get busy and they fall by the wayside and they become a flavor of the month. When something becomes a ritual, it's not hard to do. You don't struggle to remember to brush your teeth in the morning. It's just what you do. So the way we use that simple concept is we take those fundamentals that I was just describing, we roll it out to all the employees in the organization in a highly interactive way, and then we begin to focus on one of these fundamentals each week through a series of rituals. So let me give you just a simple example. One of the rituals that I do in my company and all of our clients is every time we have a meeting this week, any kind of a meeting, if it's an in-person meeting, a Zoom meeting, any meeting that's going on in my company this week, the first agenda item of the meeting is what we call the fundamental of the week. So my company's fundamental this week is one that we call practice blameless problem solving. So every meeting everywhere in my company this week, the first thing we did is we spent a few minutes talking about blameless problem solving. Next week, every meeting starts with the next fundamental. And the week after that, the next one, and the next one. We just cycle through them over and over and over again. And it gives us lots of chances all throughout the week to think about, work on, focus, practice this week's fundamental. So if we do that this week with this week's fundamental, and then we have some rituals that we practice next week's fundamental, next week and the next week, and we keep cycling through them, sooner or later, these behaviors just become internalized in people. So the simple concept, it's really simple. It's just define those behaviors that are important, create rituals to practice them week after week after week after week after week, and they're going to be internalized. I mean, there's 6 other steps to the framework, but if you just cut to the chase, do those 2 things, and you're going to be really successful. That's really the cornerstone of it.
Yeah, again, you make it so simple. So when you look at these behaviors, I have 2 questions. One is there a magic number? And then the
Mhm.
other one is, do they change? Like, when you think of core
Mhm.
values, or how I grew up about what core values were, um, typically they shouldn't change, right?
Yeah.
They're who you are. And
Yes.
how does that relate to, do the behaviors change? And when you talk about a plan, I have all these questions for you. When you talk
Hmm.
about this plan, does that mean each year they're reviewing those
Yeah.
behaviors?
Good question. So let's start with that part first, then I'll go back to your question about
Okay.
how many. So
Sorry.
that's right. That's
It got
fine.
me thinking as soon as I started saying that.
That's
Yeah.
fine. So I think of behaviors similarly to the way you were describing the traditional core values in terms of their enduring nature. That the language I use for these is, I say we should work on these with what I call an intention of permanence. And what I mean by that is that we're going to work on them, and we're going to put the effort into it to try to have this be an enduring, lasting document that stands the test of time. Now, I use that language purposely, intention of permanence, because it is an intention. We reserve the right to change. It's not like we're not allowed to, but we're not going into it thinking, let's just get it out there. And to your question, we're not going to every year review it and see what kind of changes we want to make. We want this to be something that stands the test of time. And by the way, sometimes when I say that to people, one of the pushbacks I get on occasion is, well, I mean, the world's changing, David. Don't we need to be, responsive to that? And my point of view is, absolutely we do. The changing world causes us to change our priorities, our goals and our initiatives, or maybe even our go-to-market strategy, our products and service mix, but not the core of who we are. These are foundational elements of who we are as people. So I say that we get them out there and we expect them to last forever. We're not going in trying to make changes. Now,
They're really the guardrails. I mean, it's
yes,
conceptually, it's the same concept of core values. It's just core values typically are so generic, and
yes,
people, interpret it any way they want. And they're a plaque on the wall, versus these are really action oriented
yes,
principles or
yes.
guardrails for the
Yeah,
company.
I think you're right on that they
Yeah.
serve the same purpose as the traditional core values. They just do it better.
Yeah.
But the core
Much
values are
better.
supposed to
Yeah.
play that role, but they're typically too nebulous
Yeah.
to be very effective at it. But it's the same concept. I think that's a good way of thinking of it. Now, to your question of the number of them, this is always surprising to people. So, in traditional core values thinking, people would say, well, we shouldn't have any more than 3, 4, 5, 6 at the most, because anything more than that's just crazy. So fundamentals are different than that. And so let me first talk about the number, and then I'll explain why it's not as crazy as it might sound on its surface. So I've done this process with somewhere north of 600 different organizations.
Wow.
The least I've ever seen, and this will surprise your audience, is 18. That's the only one I've ever seen less than 20. The most I've ever seen is 40. The sweet spot usually ends up, not by design, it just works this way, usually ends up somewhere between 25 and 30. In my company, I have 30. I would tell you that most companies start the process saying, you don't understand. This won't work for my people. I don't want to have any more than like 5. And none of
Because
them are
how are they
saying
going to
that today.
remember it? How are they going to
Exactly. Well,
remember it?
well,
Right.
that's
Right.
the conventional
Yeah.
wisdom is people can't remember more than that. And you're right, they can't. My point of view and what I say to them is, so That's true. But what's our goal? Is our goal to have something all of our people can recite, or is our goal to have our people live the behaviors that drive success in our company? I say it's the latter. In fact, and I say to people often, if you were to look at my 30 fundamentals, I would challenge people. If you only want to have 5, I ask them, which 25 of these do you not want to teach in your company? You'd be giving up all kinds of really important things. The reason that ultimately the number doesn't matter is because whether you had 3 or 11 or 17 or 29, we're only focusing on one each week anyway, and we're going to cycle through them over and over and over and over again for the rest of our lives. So the number doesn't really matter, and we're not going up to anybody and saying, Margaret, can you recite number 11? I don't need anybody to recite anything. I just know that if we take one at a time and we focus on it intently, and then we cycle through it over and over and over and over again, sooner or later, it's just going to become internalized in our people. So it sort of bucks conventional wisdom, but it works
It
always.
does. Well, hopefully it becomes somewhat intuitive, right? I
It
mean,
does.
once you start doing it, it's like, oh yeah, well, duh, this is how I'm going to treat my clients. But
Yes.
it forces each other to make sure you're all on the same page and how you're looking at them.
Yes. And what I would
Yeah.
add about that, I think you're right on about the way it becomes second nature. It's so fascinating to watch this. I mean, I've lived it in my own life and I've watched so many clients live it. As soon as the fundamentals get rolled out, it changes people's language. It changes how they think about things, how they see things. They can't even help it that their family will be annoyed with them because they will see fundamentals everywhere. You go to the store and you think, oh, I can see what fundamental they didn't practice there, or what somebody did. Like, you just start seeing examples of where a fundamental might have made a big difference in that situation. And it just happens automatically right away, which is what we want. We want this to be
Yeah.
internalized and influence the way that we act in the world.
I love that. I said to you, and you were with us last week, I wish I had this conversation with you 20 years ago, because
Yeah,
I do think it's such a, a smart and simple way, simple seems simple,
it is
but
simple.
way of
It is.
looking at it. It is, the concepts are simple, but it's making sure you create those right behaviors and you capture
Yes,
them and you reinforce them, as you said.
exactly.
So yeah,
When you talk
yeah,
about, it being simple, and it is simple. I say that all the time. This is not complicated. But I think that something that I say sometimes to employee groups in a what we call a rollout, where this gets introduced to the workforce, is we'll be finishing up a rollout, and I'll say to them, I'll bet most of you, when you looked at this little card, we usually print a card with the fundamentals on it for the company. And I'll say to the employees that I'll bet when you looked at this card, you thought, this isn't like anything so brilliant. Gee, we should all do what we said we were going to do. That's a novel concept. Or we should
right.
actually listen to each other or have honest conversations. Hey, that's new. And I say to them that when you look at what separates the best companies from the average ones, and the best athletes from the average ones, that the best ones don't do anything so fancy or complicated. They do what I like to call ordinary things with extraordinary consistency. To use a football term, they do the blocking and tackling more consistently than everybody else. If we were 20% better at honoring every single commitment we made, how much more successful would this company be? If we were
Yeah.
25% better at having honest conversations with each other, how much more successful? I mean, this isn't complicated stuff. And it's not, just add one element to this. Sometimes when somebody looks at a set of fundamentals, I will hear them say, well, this doesn't feel unique. And I say to them, you're right. It's not, because nobody's unique. We're all about the same. But what makes the successful ones, again, better is they just do simple things more consistently than everybody else. And
Right.
so if we just did these basic things with a lot more consistency, we would all be a lot more successful. So it doesn't have to be, sometimes people are looking for some magic bullet, some secret that is unlocked. No, it's pretty simple stuff. Just do it consistently. You're going to be successful.
It goes back to, what is it? Execution eats
Execution.
strategy for lunch, right?
Yeah.
At the
Yep.
end of the
It's
day,
just
you have,
execution.
yeah, it's executing effectively.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I love talking to you, and I could talk to you forever. I want to be cognizant of your time. So, just a few last things. One is, are there any insights or parting words that you would share with our viewers in addition to what we've talked about today on this
I
topic?
would say it's just that if you don't purposely create your culture is going to happen anyway. And
Mhm.
it's too important, as we talked about earlier, understanding that it's the single biggest leverage item you can work on that touches more aspects of your business than anything else. It's hard to think of something that would be more important as a leader than to get your culture right. And you got to, as a leader, it's your responsibility. The leader, if you're the CEO listening to this, you are the chief cultural officer. It is your responsibility to be the leader of your culture.
I love that because we don't always think about um, the cultures. There's a culture, just whether it's the culture you want or not. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yes.
So that's such a great last point. But before you go, I know you are one of the most popular Vistage speakers we have. I think meeting with my group, it was your 700th
Yes.
meeting or presentation, which is amazing. And you've had so much success in your own business. I know you've written 3 books. If someone wants to talk to you and hire you or get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that? And how do you help them?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, my website is CultureWise, the word culture, WISE, all one word, culturewise.com. And people can reach me at david@culturewise.com. And I actually respond to things. Sometimes people are surprised because one of our fundamentals is to be a fanatic about response time. And so
I was just gonna say,
we
got to
do
be
that.
tied into
I live my
that.
fundamentals. So we're very fast to get back to people. So I do respond rapidly. So that's the best place to reach me. What we do for companies is we help them implement this particular system that's described on the website. And the cornerstone of that system is we help companies figure out their fundamentals. We help develop them. We help them roll it out. We help them get up and running and practicing them so they can see this major impact. And the process that we've done, as I mentioned earlier, we've done it with more than 600 companies. In 30 to 60 days, we can have a company up and running, practicing their
Wow.
fundamentals. So this doesn't have to be an enormously expensive, convoluted 2-year project. In 60 days, a company can be practicing their fundamentals.
And just start to move forward with it. So
It'll make a big difference
what a
rapidly.
great easy way. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, good. Well, thank you. And thank you again for last week. Thank you for
you're
your
welcome.
time today. This is the stuff that growth is made of.
My pleasure, Margaret. Great to be with you.